Oh, hello. Good to see you. Hello, is it on? Okay, hello and welcome everybody to Fuller Theological Seminary. It is amazing to be here live and in person, and for all of you guys tuning in online, we welcome you, and we're so glad that you've decided to join us for the celebration of Asian Pacific American, okay? Keep going, okay. So in the celebration of Asian and Pacific Islander American Heritage Month. So my name's Janette Ok, and I serve as Associate Professor of New Testament here at Fuller, and I'm honored to be affiliated also with the Asian American Center, who is hosting this special event. So as many of you guys know, the theme for this event is hope and healing, but Fuller celebrates and equips members of the AAPI community throughout the entire year, not just in the month of May, but this is very special, and so we're glad you joined us. Our Center for Asian American Theology and Ministry, also known as the AAC, exists to research, equip, and resource the Asian American church. So we train and support Asian American leaders and non-Asian American leaders who are serving and working with Asian Americans. We help Asian American students of East, Southeast, and South Asian descent, including multiracial individuals and adoptees, to help them ground their life and their work in over 170 years of Asian American history, and the particular spiritual and psychological concerns, needs, gifts, and challenges of our community. We offer so many resources, I cannot list them all, so please check it out in our website. And we teach courses, events, formation groups, mentorship, and have a centering podcast. So please engage and connect, whether you're from Fuller or abroad. So now it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Jonathan Tran is Associate Professor of Religion at Baylor University, where he holds the Baines Chair of Religion. He's the author of Vietnam War and Theologies of Memory, Foucault and Theology, and the subject of today's conversation, Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, which was just published by OUP in 2021. He serves as a series co-editor for Encountering Religions for Stanford University Press, and for the American Academy of Religion series, Reflection and Theory in the Study of Religion for OUP. Along with David Chow and Melissa Borja, he is a principal investigator for a Henry Luce Foundation grant studying how Asian American religious communities pursue coalitional justice. So Dr. Tran's Asian American Theology lecture is titled More Than You Can Ask or Imagine, God's Great Hope for the Asian American Church. And after his lecture, we'll have the privilege of hearing responses from the Reverend Dr. Oscar García-Johnson and Dr. SueJeanne Koh, followed by Q&A. And it's going to be a rich discussion, so please stick around for that. Without further ado, friends, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Tran.
President Laberton, for this community, and really for its rich legacy of serving Asian Americans over decades now. So if you heard my chapel remarks, I just want to say that this is going to have a different spirit to it. You could think about this lecture as a encouragement for us to all take our spirit-laced liquid courage for the kind of work we need to step in the years ahead. So my remarks today focus on some ecclesial implications drawn from my recent book, Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, or AASRC, an acronym that is as much a mouthful as the book itself, and how that book tries to think about Asian Americans as a prism through which to understand race and racism on the one hand and the Christian church on the other. The book began as a sort of assignment ode to a Christian publisher, The aim of that assignment was simple enough: apply Christian race concepts to the case of Asian Americans. Attempting to fulfill that assignment, I imagined taking the usual anti-racist concepts and expanding them out to include Asian Americans. Perhaps one finds similar strategies used by other communities racially marginalized by the white-black racial binary. This assignment seemed simple enough given how powerful the usual concepts felt and how often Asian American theorists deployed them. However, a deep dive into the literature and serious thought about the aims of the assignment revealed the project to be a lost cause. I decided to change course and take on a much larger project, to step into much headier headspace. It became apparent to me that I would need to try to rethink these concepts, rethinking in the process race and racism in America, and following out the implications for the Christian church. Doing so entailed moving the project to an established university press. With the help of some friends, I came to realize that the new project would be pushing against strong headwinds, and so it would need the imprimatur of a university press to help it along. It sought to make a number of interventions across multiple fields and disciplines. It would need all the help it could get. Asian American voices usually don't count in the academy, and they count even less when it comes to projects like these. I enlisted Oxford to help me to do what I felt needed doing. Whether any of this is right or any of it worked, I don't know, but I certainly felt the need for it. The book's 3 aims go as follow. First, it aims to shift the conversation on race and racism. It does so by turning to political economy as a way to frame what I see as a wrong-headed emphasis on racial identity, and racial identity as either a conceptual principle of analysis or a political site of organizing. I argue that the former doesn't work and that the latter hampers the cause of liberation. As to the former, I show through involved historical and ethnographic case studies that using racial identity or race generally in order to explain material realities proves hugely inadequate to the phenomenon in question. Here I simply want to remind us that race permits of weak explanatory power, leading to confusions that severely impair our ability to bring the world into focus, including a world profoundly in need of liberation. As to the latter, I show how, rather than organizing around constituent racial identities, we need to find sure political footing, leaving the sinking sand of race nationalism and finding our way to the rough ground of coalitional political solidarity. This political intervention feels especially urgent in this moment as Asian Americans turn to their own versions of race nationalism in response to a politicized, pandemic-driven onslaught of anti-AAPI hate and violence. This turn to racial nationalism as a bulwark against this onslaught will increasingly for us become the go-to move. We will think that organizing our own racial identity, we will find that organizing around our own racial identity, whatever that is, will be our only recourse, even if it is not. Whether we can find our way to alternatives in time, I believe will determine the course of the future of Asian America. This first aim constructively involves me in framing racism in terms of political economy, a framework I call following elements of the Black radical tradition, racial capitalism. While this constructive formulation has been the central focus of many discussions around my book, I will not focus on it here, though I'm happy to discuss it with my conversation partners later, or any of you if you should wish to discuss it and pursue it. If the book turns out to move the dial on Christian conversations on race and racism, it will have done so by foregrounding political economy as the framework through which we think about race and racism, shifting race and racism conversations from racial identities to the political economies that produce and utilize them, replacing racial identity as a principle of analysis and as a site of political organizing. The big implication here, to be clear, is the suggestion that anti-racist strategies built on racial identity don't get us closer to liberation. In fact, they push us further away. My approach leaves open the question of, after I have prosecuted my case about political economy, what remains left of racial identity? And I leave to others to advance its cause if they should remain wedded to it in the face of the questions I put to it. Second, the book aims to make its argument about political economy through the prism of Asian American racial life. In this sense, AASRC is more an argument made through Asian Americans than it is an argument about Asian Americans, which is, however one feels about that, at least consistent with my great ambivalence about racial identity and its representational politics. My engagement with Asian Americans starts from what I take to be a rather familiar experience for those of us racialized as Asian Americans, including and perhaps especially in the academy. And this experience of one I describe in the book as being marginalized by anti-racism after having first been marginalized by racism. That is, I find that Asian Americans have been given very little room at the table when it comes to conversations about race and racism, as if we don't count, only count in secondary or tertiary or even suspicious ways. I take that experience and universalize it in order to think through this broader race and racism conversation. Instead of trying to expand out the usual white-black concepts to include Asian Americans, as was the aim of that since-abandoned assignment, I ask how the concepts work such that they necessarily exclude Asian Americans. Rather than expand the concepts so that they might include marginalized people, I argue that the fact that the concepts marginalize already marginalized people suggests that they ought to be abandoned. Accordingly, I turn the tables on the practical problem of anti-racist marginalization and try to turn a conceptual disadvantage into a perceptual advantage. I examine what can be seen about race and racism conversations from the margins of those conversations, and then try to re-theorize matters from the perspective of those margins. In writing this book, I imagined myself releasing the miner's canary of Asian America into the mind of American race and racism conversations. Release was for me the operative word, since I felt through the whole process the urge to hold on to Asian America, to protect it and shield it from how the current politics of identity relegated it and dismissed it, always as a matter of course, and quite often cruelly, without so much as noticing. I realized that we needed to conceptually release the canary because current conversations would kill or harm it anyway, and we might as well learn as much as we can from those experiences. This is my way of using my good friend, Professor Melissa Borhal's apt phrase of turning pain into power, of turning practical pain into conceptual power. Releasing the canary of Asian Americans into the American race and racism conversation resulted in three critical insights, I believe. First, the obvious absurdity of casting Asian Americans as a race exposes the political economic role race always plays in American life. Shoehorning what are clearly endlessly diverse and complex histories, nationalities, cultures, ethnicities, languages, migration stories, peoples, and people into a single racial category shows once again that something fishy is going on whenever race is invoked to explain anything. Once the Black Marxists got behind the curtain of colonial and industrial era race politics and realized race served as a labor and property distinction, they realized that race wasn't at all about difference or diversification. It was rather about ideologically driven differentiation and stratification. Similarly, even a cursory look at the transnational migrational history of Asian Americans reveals that race is a ruse of power, that it does not work as an explanatory category exactly at the same time that it does work as a way of facilitating a pervasive political economy built on dominative exploitation. Placing Asian Americans at the center of the American race and racism conversation blows that conversation up by showing that race and racism are about political economy, not racial identities. While I will not get here into the specifics, this political economic approach leaves doubtful many of the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies assumed by our respective institutions. These practices and these visions tend to take racial identity for granted while leaving intact its exploitative political economy. That's why they don't work. Those two need to be rethought unless we are content with, rather than liberation, at best inhumanely diversifying the elite ranks of an unjust society. The second insight follows. Asian American theorists often proceed under the impression that tropes like the model minority myth and paradigms like the white-black binary, we act as if these issue as accidental features of race thinking. As so many unfortunate theoretical and political accretions that can be removed like unwanted barnacles accruing at the bottom of a boat. They are not. These are not accidents. Rather, they are the creatures of race thinking, the result of a political economy that needs someone to play the role of the model minority, needs someone to be pitted against other racial identities. They are the result of racial capitalism's zero-sum, us versus them logic that is binary in form and in content. When I say that race and racism instantiate a political economy, I mean that it needs to pit people in competition with one another in order to divide and conquer. The binary sets up the infighting, and the model minority myth locks it in place. Du Bois saw this in relationship to poor white people and poor black people in Black Reconstruction. Oliver Cromwell Cox saw in relationship to Chinese migrant laborers in caste, class, and race. Noel Ignatieff saw it more recently in How the Irish Became White. Heather McGhee saw it very recently in The Sum of Us, How Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Instead of endlessly battling back this or that version of the model minority myth and the white-black binary, Asian American theorists will be better served stepping back and taking stock of why they keep on coming back, what makes them unavoidable, and how not stepping back and how rehearsing the same old theoretical battles will end in self-fulfilling prophecies. The third follows the first two insights. Telling the story of Asian Americans demonstrates the need for much more sophisticated moral concepts in order to get at the terror of American racism. In our activist commitments, we tend to valorize matters by casting things in stark terms between good and evil, victim and victimizer, person of color versus white person. This simply will not do. Asian Americans, with their highly morally complicated stories throughout American racism, as oftentimes playing multiple roles, often at once, they show the need that we need to think about these things with much greater sophistication than we tend to. The book offers large case studies that involve Asian Americans in any number of roles simultaneously, sometimes victims of racial capitalism, other times beneficiaries of it. I recount how Chinese migrants to the Reconstruction South arrived as exploited labor and remained as exploiters of Black neighbors. I show how post-Hart-Celler, 1965, I show how Asian Americans often take on identities as Asian Americans through contemporary forms of resource hoarding, principally in American educational systems. I also show how Asian Americans can, by dispossessing themselves of those very benefits and privileges, exact amazing forms of resistance, proclaiming God's justice and mercy through lives of dispossessive joy. The book attempts to show how the most pernicious effect of the model minority myth isn't that it gets Asian Americans wrong or that it disciplines other people of color. All that is rather obvious. Rather, the scariest thing about the model minority myth is how much Asian Americans are drawn to it and feel compelled to live out its scripts, which cannot come in the context of racial capitalism without perpetuating injustice. These are complicated stories befitting a complicated reality. Perhaps racism requires no more of us than the false moral clarity of good guys versus bad guys storylines. Racial capitalism requires more of us. Too often, anti-racism fixates on hyperbolic images of racism. The Klansman and his burning cross, the red-faced sheriff setting in on the civil rights workers, the redlining mortgage worker. When racism rather should be understood in terms of our settled agreements with everyday structures and systems of housing, healthcare, education, etc., and the diseased racial imaginations justifying these structures and systems. I fear that our activism has resulted in a felt need to blunt what otherwise needs to be sharp moral concepts, to get clear about the challenges in front of us and the promises and demands of the Christian gospel. Our activism deserves sharp analyses, not the blunt force instruments anti-racists increasingly rely on, like discourses preoccupied by whiteness, the kind of stuff that brings a lot of heat but does little work. If in the name of political expediency, we trade out the rich moral psychology Christian theology offers for the thinned out rhetoric of virtual signaling cancel culture, by which the current political culture on both the left and the right will consume itself, if we do that, we will find ourselves bereft of the very tools that might otherwise help us find our way to liberation. These three insights gleaned from the book's second aim of theorizing racism and racism through Asian Americans leads to the book's third and final aim. I wanted to tell a story where the Christian church in America is not just a villain, which is not to say that in my book, the American church isn't a villain, for it surely is, comprising what I characterize as an unholy trinity between the church, America, and racism. Those Chinese Americans who settled in the Reconstruction South by exploiting Black neighbors adopted white Baptist Christianity in large part because it spiritually endorsed that exploitation. But these distortions are distortions of a more fundamental good, which is the Christian church as the gathered body around the given body of Christ crucified, and as we celebrate in this season, resurrected. The church as villain isn't the last word of the Christian church in America. It isn't because the one who writes its story is also the one who will bring it to completion. So I tell the story of a church in a marginalized part of San Francisco that helps those racialized as Asian Americans to refuse the model minority script on the way to lives of reparative repentance as they take up residence with diverse neighbors inhabiting goodness, truth, and beauty. This Sunday, I visited with another church here in Los Angeles trying to do something similar. These local churches are communities that feel the political economic tug of American racism and their own complicities within it. And they seek, rather than leaning into racial capitalism, to instead try to stand against it. The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the Gospels is the word through which Jesus inaugurates his public ministry. What I try to show in the case of the San Francisco church is that the ability to call time on racial capitalism will come in the flow of worship, where the primary political key is proclamation of God's justice and mercy as being natural to the world, because justice and mercy are natural to God. And hence, I imagine the ecologies of human political economies as participating in the deep economy of God's Trinitarian life. The sum total of the book's three aims is, I hope, to offer an account of Christianity that is more than what Asian American Christians have tended to ask for or imagine, because our imaginations have been nourished or malnourished on racial capitalism. In places where I have talked about the book, the sum total aim of the book has gotten lost among the trees of its various specific three aims, including in spaces where the book's theological aims were hardly even noticed. In this space, here at Fuller, which has played such a significant role in my own development as a Christian, racialized as Asian American, I hope for more, and I ask for more. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tran, for that really expansive, challenging lecture. I'd like to ask our panelists to join us up here. But first, Dr. Oscar Garcia-Johnson, I'll introduce you, but you guys can come on up and have a seat. So Reverend Dr. Oscar Garcia-Johnson is currently the Chief of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Professor of Theology and Latinx Studies here at Fuller Seminary. He is an ordained American Baptist minister and was a regional minister with the ABCLA. So he has planted already 4 churches. He loves cycling, cooking, woodworking, and socializing. He's just a cool guy overall. He's a sought-after speaker who engages his audience with vivid images and keen provocations, capable of moving participants to unreached imaginative spaces for rethinking, sensing, relating, and acting on old and fresh ideas. He uses decolonial theories in the fields of theology, religion, ministry, and cultural studies to reimagine Christian identity in the global space. His writings include Spirit Outside the Gate, Theology Without Borders, and Mestizo Community of the Spirit. Thank you, Dr. Garcia, for being here. Our next and after Dr. Garcia-Johnson will be Dr. SueJeanne Koh. She is Graduate Futures Program Director of the Humanities Center at the University of California, Irvine. She oversees and develops programming for humanities doctoral students on professional development and multiple career pathways. SueJeanne is also the Director of Adult Education and Resident Theologian for New Hope and St. Mark Presbyterian Churches in Orange County. She has written and published essays on Asian American Christian theologies, healthcare, and cross-racial solidarity. More recently, her research interests include graduate education reform. Dr. Koh serves in leadership capacities for the American Academy of Religion and Society of Christian Ethics. So we're thrilled and honored to have you both here as part of this conversation. So Would you come up, please, Oscar, to respond to Jonathan's lecture?
Thank you very much, Dr. Tran, and feel very happy to be given the opportunity to dialogue with such a group of scholars and colleagues on a topic I am passionate but have really much to learn about. To claim otherwise would be not only presumptuous, but misleading for both my training as a Latinx scholar of theology and my current role as chief of DEI can only offer solidarity, incomplete knowledge, and commitment to walking together with the Asian American sisters and brothers in a journey of thinking and doing church otherwise in the backdrop of racial capitalism and global coloniality. With this disclaimer in mind, I'm ready to confess that I was barely able to produce one single question. And that's what I want to offer as my response to Dr. Tran's wonderful and I would say rich presentation. So if you can put that question, I even want you to see the question because I think it's a little compounded, but I think I hope this question is built with a great degree of your own language and with your own research. And he says like this: what would it take for Asian American churches to resist racial capitalism, determined by its rhetoric of the model minority myth, as well as its fiction of equity and affluence and cultural self-sufficiency in the white American societal hierarchy, in a way that such resistance turns into resilience, and resilience turns into Asian American re-existence within a pluralistic scenario of a coalition of political solidarity alongside other minoritized populations. I think you've done enough to answer this question. And we get to have this conversation for a long time, many of us. And I'm very grateful that this is there. But in many ways, I resonate with your intellectual and pastoral journey. As a Latinx immigrant from Honduras, I've had to deal with a sort of a model minority myth within the Hispanic population, namely the first wave of Cuban Americans received by the US as a Cold War strategy and made into exemplars of affluence and cultural adaptability and nationality. Like you, I've also worked within the rubrics of a pan-ethnic framework, except mine keeps changing: Chicano, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, Latine, etc. This, of course, is in reference to my diasporic life and work within the United States. But when it comes to my life outside of the United States, which I do have, in the Americas, and its transnationality and other nationality, which informs my global identity, I've had to create, even attempt to another alternative language, to another framework that helps to capture the communal possibilities across the continent. And it's also a form of pan-ethnic or trans-ethnic framework that I have coined as the American Global South, to refer to the South in the South and the South in the North of the American continent. It is perhaps on this very point of inflection, this geopolitics of knowledge in the American Global South, US included, that I see some potential differences with your methodology to address the matter of race and economics and racism, as you elaborate in the case of Asian Americans. The Americas have had a long history of coloniality and resistance, about 500, and have been at the center of the elaboration of liberation theology, dependency theory, as well as worth system analysis. Hence, political economy has been proposed as a framing device for liberation several times and in several places without definite success. At the same time, in the US Latino diaspora, like several Asian American theoreticians, the Latino diasporan theologians or theoreticians have been heavily vested in cultural analysis and critical race theory, also without much success to resolving the oppression both internally and externally, to your point. We have learned that both models, identitarian anti-racism and political economy for that matters, have operated within Eurocentric logics, Marxism and liberalism, to name some. Hence, any form of liberation from various forms of racism, systemic poverty, genocides, ecocides, epistemicides, etc., would have to come from the outside and the borderlines of the West, and will have to offer more than political economy and identitarian anti-racist approaches, without disregarding both of them, but not relying on only those two. As a consequence, I have adopted a more complex and hopefully more complete framing device to cope with colonial modernity world systems and its classification and segregation mechanism, which is what is at stake here, really. This is called the colonial matrix of power, initially evoked by Aníbal Quijano, a Peruvian sociologist, who, by the way, worked hand in hand with Emanuel Wallerstein, the architect of the world system that you use. The CMP, Colonial Matrix of Power, includes political economy and race identity theories, but goes beyond them individually and together to understand that modernity as a planetary phenomena is then a function of European asymmetric relationships of power with other contexts, particularly but not exclusively with the colonial subject, which has resulted in the process of subalternization of colonial subjects and peripherization of non-capitalist European and non-European economies. This explains the necessity of race, ethnicity, gender, and class as subaltern categories, all related to labor, productivity, and power. All this is to say that I find some resonance with the question presented to your work by my American Baptist colleague, Reverend Jana Lowy, a Fuller grad, and also somebody who's related with the Christian from Social Action. And I quote, "Is it my cynicism that assumes we're too far gone in our current discourse on racial politics to focus primarily on political economy? Or is it the responsibility of practitioners to engage in anti-racist work with a double-edged sword, encouraging creative participation in divine economy, while also engaging the evolving discourse on racial identity. I think Janet's query invites a more complex and complete approach to race and racism. In the same breath, and to conclude my reaction, I also find Kwon King-woo's question from Loyola University, Chicago, important, which indeed takes me back to my original question. And I quote, "If Tran is rightly concerned about identitarian anti-racism, how can we also avoid Christian forms of identitarianism? Where is the discussion on coalitional politics of interfaith organizing that cut across the boundary between Asian American Christians and, say, Black abolitionists like Angela Davis, who is also formed by Black radical traditions?" I hope you have heard me as a companion in the journey, as somebody who's learning from your work, and somebody who's, like you, very interested in another church and another world that is possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia-Johnson. Before I begin, I want to thank Dr. Daniel Lee and the Center for Asian American Theology and Ministry for the invitation over 2 years ago to respond to Dr. Jonathan Tran's work. And I also want to thank Fuller Seminary for hosting Jillian Garcia, Jason Chu, Jenny Webb, Chantel, and others who attended to the logistics to make this happen today. So as I mentioned, COVID put an end to the timeline that was originally envisioned. So I'm especially grateful to be here today with Janette, Oscar, and Jonathan. And I know that Jonathan really wanted to be here in person for the good boba and ethnic Asian food. Perhaps recognizing how the pandemic has upended so many of our lives is actually a good place for me to start, because it's also how Jonathan begins his book, with reference to the pandemic and how it has revealed, apocalyptically, the ways that race and racism have structured our common realities. The pandemic has disproportionately affected Black and Latinx communities. There has also been another scourge that has been brought to searing light, that of police violence and brutality against Blacks, bringing to light the ongoing legacies of chattel slavery in our country. Just as critically, people of Asian descent have been the objects of verbal and physical abuse and violence because of how Asians have been perceived as the origin of COVID-19. Jonathan wonders about the disconnect between anti-Black and anti-Asian violence, operating as two independent phenomena rather than connected. And I think that in large part, Jonathan is trying to answer this question through his book and offer a way forward. Said more constructively, what haunts his inquiry, I think, is a question of belonging. How do we belong to each other? How is belonging theological? And how do we belong to a world in a way that acknowledges its part in its brokenness and works to repair it? Let me start with a few observations of what I think is most valuable about Jonathan's project, especially in reference to his lecture and for Asian American church communities. And I should say that by limiting my observations to a few, it's more about time rather than what Jonathan's book offers. And I hope I do it justice. So one, I appreciate his book because of how it points to racialization as a structural and systemic reality. He does so by providing larger historical context of how immigrants of Asian descent, particularly the Delta Chinese, have faced and negotiated their terms of belonging, terms that have implications for Asian Americans today. I don't think that many Asian American Christians, or even Asian Americans in general, know this history. And what's important about his analysis is that he shows how the question of belonging in this country has been entangled with logics of Christianity, of how it has often been expressed, to use Evelyn Higginbotham's phrase, as a politics of respectability, pitting minoritized communities against each other. I think that this historical casting is important and needed because he argues that we are racialized, not raced, and that we are racialized through political economy or racial capitalism. His argument counters a particular anti-racist narrative that depends on an ontological origin point of whiteness, with blackness as its logical opposite. Why I think this is especially important for Asian American Christians is because the realities of race within Christian communities has more often been described in static terms, so that the problem of racism is one of diversity rather than racial justice. He pushes Asian American Christians to not only understand themselves in terms of their families of origin, but as part of this larger interwoven fabric of communities with long histories that have tried to navigate the landscape of North America as strangers in a foreign land. I think that this is right, but I also think that the sources for our identity-based politics are as much due to the larger anti-racism discourse as it is a problem about how we read Scripture. I'll try to return to this point at the end, but want to note it here. The second point that Jonathan makes related to my first point, and which I think is specifically valuable for Asian American Christians, is how he pushes against a complete disavowal of the model minority myth. In the book, he's more explicitly in conversation with certain Asian American scholars who depend on social science methods and analyses to destroy the myth of the model minority. These scholars depend on disaggregating Asian American data to show that Asian American experiences are not as flattened as one thinks, often highlighting the realities of Southeast Asians or South Asians to tell a different story about the successes of Asian America. So the thing that I think Asian American Christians should especially take note of from this observation is one of method. Engage critically with the resources about Asian America and resist the temptation to take everything in wholesale because of your hunger for representation. This critical engagement requires us to have our children learn earlier about Asian American studies and requires adults to commit to the task of learning from the deep scholarship of Asian American studies so that they can critically engage with it themselves. I believe that this is an important aspect of our discipleship, not an elective apart from it. But just as significantly, Asian Americans and Asian American Christians have been complicit in the creation of the model minority myth and deployed it towards our own ends. Instead of thinking of the reality of the model minority in terms of black and white, he challenges us to think of the model minority in shades of gray. There is moral ambiguity with the model minority because, as an aspirational goal, it is a model of desire constructed within the framework of racial capitalism. So Jonathan talks about the economy of desire at a few key places throughout his book, particularly in terms of Augustine's treatment in The City of God as a foil against the economy of desire that Afro-pessimism highlights. Again, I'll return to this, but I think it's critically important to sit with the model minority myth as a formation rather than as a given, because it connects to my third point. So 3, it's important to think about the model minority myth as a formation rather than as a given, because I think formation situates us within a concrete and material context in a way that a static framing of the model minority myth does not. So, theologically, he invites Asian American Christians into the work of God's liberation rather than the work of salvation. And he pushes us towards liberation rather than salvation because of how soteriological language has been co-opted in Christian history, often separated from the situatedness of our contexts. Jonathan pushes us to use our imaginations to move in our spaces, in our communities, to live out God's great hope for the Asian American church. The question is, how do we do that? He offers one example through Redeemer Church. There is no question that the church community is committed to its sense of place, to engaging with the communities that share that space with them. And that there is no question that the church members whom he describes and portrays are committed to living out the gospel in material ways by dispossessing themselves in order to invest in others. But I was left with the question with how two realities relate, that of theology and desire. Jonathan uses the framework of political economy to both describe the distortions of racial capitalism as well as God's deep economy to which Christians should turn. Revelation, participation, and reparation form a Trinitarian circle from which Christians should take their cues. But I think in Jonathan's attempt to describe and interpret how participation and reparation look like, we are still left with the question of revelation, or how we construct our theology, and more specifically, our scriptural interpretations. In other words, I think that political economy can only go so far in helping us interpret our shared and entangled formations as a framework of distribution rather than of circulation. How do people at Redeemer interpret Scripture, and how has that created and embedded them into the structures of racial capitalism? How has theological interpretation informed their relationships with others, each other? What kind of theological interpretations are they encountering in their neighborhoods with their Black and Latinx neighbors? Are there other ways to relate to the land and their communities other than through the discourse of capital? And if God's deep economy is ultimately about worship, then how does that inform our actual practices of worship in our communities? And here, I want to note that apart from an observation on how Redeemer's worship is not actually very compelling, it doesn't really take center stage in Jonathan's theological reflections, and I guess I was looking for a little more of that. Moreover, should we not also consider and articulate the reality that even though Redeemer is multiracial and recognizes and wrestles with this, that they are still a rather homogeneous group of people, both in terms of educational achievement and ethnic backgrounds, mostly East Asian? Are they, as religion scholar Rudy Busto might put it, spiritual model minorities? If they are there by dint of shared model minority formation, an affinity group, as it were, there needs to be more reckoning with not only how this informs their relationships with others outside of their communities, but how this has informed their decisions to be with each other, as a community, in their marriages, and so on. What kind of theologies are they teaching their own children about how to be in the world? Is the reality of Asian American identity a being as well as becoming, as literary scholar Jim Lee might say? And so I want to end with one more question or a provocation of whether the logical conclusion of Jonathan's book, his constructive proposal of dispossession, might actually mean the disconnect of Asian American Christianities from the Asian American church, meaning that perhaps the way forward might mean offering many different narratives of what it might look like to be an Asian American Christian. I wish, for example, as he so poignantly preached from his own life experience, and we meditated on together in chapel, that he entered into the Asian American story through the realities of being actual and spiritual refugees, not only in terms of trauma and suffering, but also joy and resilience. But mostly, I want to thank Jonathan for his deep engagement through his work and for his heart for the Asian American church. I look forward to our shared conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, our respondents to Jonathan's lecture. And I want to give you some time to respond, Jonathan, to SueJeanne and to Oscar. And in the meantime, I have an announcement. So on the screen, they're going to put up a text code. And for those in person and online, if you have any questions, you text it to 626-655-1775, whether you're in this room or online, so that I'll do my best to vet or to read your questions. And if your compelling and burning question isn't answered or called out, please don't get offended. It's really for lack of time. So please think about your question as they
engage one another here. So thank you.
So first, cannot say thank you enough to both you for your scholarship ongoing, your work and leadership in this community, UC Irvine, friendship, and the seriousness in which you've engaged my work, I think as demonstration of the seriousness in which you pursue the gospel in your careers and in your lives. So an amazing thank you. And I don't know if I need to say much more than that, but since you asked me to. And this is brief, but we can talk a bit more about it, Dr. Garcia-Johnson. So my argument is that political economy is a better framework to think about these questions than what I call an identitarian framework, which isn't quite to say that political economy is the only framework we will need. So that would be one side of that. But the other side of that is to say that what you describe in a kind of decolonial, post-colonial move, I don't know if that is different than political economy, or it is the fulfillment of political economy or an analysis from political economy. That is what you see, and this is a history that we academics are just now coming to terms with, that I think people from other places in the world, it's just obvious to them. But in the United States, we still have not come to terms with the fact that the turn to political economy was met by the buzzsaw of an emerging political neoliberal capitalist reality that was paired with a cultural turn in the academy that did wonders on political economy. Namely, it took its nerve out of it. And so what you see in most political economy that is insufficient exactly in the way you lay out, I don't know if that, I think that is political economy that lost its nerve, that recognized what a political economic analysis would require and what it entails and the conclusions that it would draw. And it ran into a world that was largely a reaction to what anticipated where this would go. And so what you see in the 80s and 90s, and especially in the American Academy, is a cultural turn that blunts the edge of the turn to political economy. This is not a turn that I think post-colonial, decolonial context could afford, or it maybe even occurred to them. And so I think I fully take your point. I want to say that at least the account of political economy that I'm imagining that does take its cues from folks like Wallerstein or Cox, but I think can be logically drawn into some of the work that you're imagining. And here I would name a few kind of post-colonial thinkers that I think track quite well with this, while also very much taking aim at some of the kind of identitarian things it sounds like both of us are worried about. So, and that's just a longer conversation. I think this is a critically important conversation that needs to go on in the academy. But I do want to say that there is a powerful history, and you can name very specific moments where the political economic turn is blunted. It is turned back because people recognize how dangerous it is. So I want to imagine if that trajectory is allowed to continue, that it is not different than what you are powerfully encouraging us toward. And then, Professor Koh, I mean, thank you for acknowledging the things you see that the book is doing or that my work is trying to do. I love the way you put the model minority myth as a formation. I wish I had thought about it in those terms. I think I implicitly did, but that's exactly right. That's my worry about the model minority myth, not as a monolithic concept that then needs to be combated by what I described as endless cycles of Asian American theorists trying to push it back. What you name is that it is a much more incipient reality because it is morally formative in character. And then you name Christian communities in another way that asks Professor Garcia-Johnson's question that was projected, shows this formation in Asian American space, and specifically, maybe particularly in Asian American Christian space. So I think that's just a brilliant formulation and really gets at what I wanted to, but you complete, I think, much better than I do. So, okay, I want to try to deal with this question that you put to Redeemer, or I don't think you mean it personally about Redeemer, you mean any example like that. And I think the most forceful criticisms of my book, the ones I've tried to take to heart, the ones that made me think, gosh, I wish I wrote a different book, are the kind that Professor Garcia-Johnson puts forward, which is, does your account of political economy as a framework, is it sufficient for this set of phenomena, right? And you can name the ones you named or substitute others. That's an incredibly important question, and I take your question to be a kind of friendly amendment. That is, you think it does work, you want to see it do more work. And I think for someone like me, I need to answer that question, does it do the work necessary? So that's one set of questions that have been very powerfully put, and you articulated it brilliantly today. The other kind of question that Professor Koh raises is the kind of question that says, I think that Tran's accounts of racial capitalism does work, but I am not sure that the constructive proposal he offers can bear the weight of answering the analysis. And I think that's right. What I love about the question is it takes seriously the analysis and tries to follow out what kind of constructive remedies would actually respond positively to it. And that's how I take the question, and this question, I think, is really hard. I'm not sure I know how to answer this question. I will say this, and this is not against SueJeanne, who I've known for years, and we're cut from the same cloth because we went to a seminary or a graduate program that talked about the church, incessantly. But as a person that came to Christianity late in life, as a young adult, and found in the church what I would describe as maybe the best thing since sliced bread, I want to ask the question, and maybe this is more a pastoral question of the academy than it is a theoretical one, which is I am worried about the tendency when talking about the church to always revert to a posture of critique in a way that makes me wonder if any example of the church can satisfy an analysis. I mean, the church, the articulation of the church as response, God's response to the world, isn't the exemplification of perfection, it's the articulation of faithfulness, it seems to me. And if the burden that has to be borne by any instance of trying to say, at least we sense the gospel here, is that it has to answer every possible critique, I worry that is a posture of the academy more than what the promise and demands of the church in the New Testament are, if that makes sense. And so I see the church in the New Testament as endlessly undergoing the critique of the New Testament, endlessly shown to be unfaithful or imperfect. But there's also the willingness to stake a claim, to say that God is many places in the world, but God is also here. And that is true not in the face of perfection, in the instance of perfection, but in the very instance of imperfection. And my worry is that our unwillingness to do that, to stake something in the sand, to say that God is here, is our own kind of academy-nourished failure of nerve. And this is true not only in, it's simply a way of saying hope requires us to stake something, to name something, to identify some group of people, even if we know that the moment we do that, we've already jinxed them to not live up to the picture. And yet that's what it seems like God does with the New Testament over and over with the church is, it's not like God is surprised that the church goes south over and over. And yet there is still a covenantal claim in relationship to a church that I want to reclaim as Christians. This is a kind of claim that's both pastoral, as I just said, about the theological academy, but it is also an emerging claim in the secular academy. If you think of people like Turmoy at Duke University, Rita Feltsky at the University of Virginia, and Feltsky's book, Post-Critique, she worries that in literary studies, she wants to make a distinction between critique, which is rejection, and criticism, which is an inhabitation.
And she worries that in the academy, in our drive, our ever-driven need to be clever, we no longer make the distinction between critique and criticism. We no longer how to make claims on things as if they're ours. We no longer know how to inhabit space. Because the cleverness of the academy is to consistently raise up the question of its limit. And there is a political implication here, that if we are not willing to draw a claim somewhere, to make a stake somewhere, then politically, what are we willing to risk? Because if it is the case that the risks are staked on the possibility of failure, then it seems to me we will risk very little. And what we are in need of at this moment is not perfection, but the attempt at faithfulness, and I think that is critical. I want theologians to lay claim to the possibility of hope in the face of despair. That's where hope lives, it seems to me. That's what Christianity gives us. If there's a sliced bread that I found in the church, it was the reception of a kid that had experienced as much trauma as I had to an inculcation of a life that offered hope in the midst of that trauma. And I don't want the academy, the Christian academy, to give that up. I think that is one of the best things we have to offer. And I say that, and I say this in the book, I think pretty cognizant of the church's extraordinary failures and violence. I say that as a reader and an insufficient reader of the New Testament and the Old Testament. I say that, I think, as a statement of faith. I say that because I believe I have to say that. Because I'm not sure if I can't say something like that, I'm just not sure what the point is. It seems like we have to lay our claims, put our stakes somewhere, risking the possibility of failure or risking hope in the face of its inevitability. So.
Thank you. There's some questions from the audience live and on Zoom, so I'd like to raise a few. So what does all this mean for the work of mission and discipleship for Asian Americans? So for example, Dr. Koh gave some ideas about how Asian American studies need to be part of discipleship and spiritual formation, but what would you say to that?
Janet, can you ask the first question?
What is all that your book and your talk, how can you relate this to the work of mission and discipleship for Asian Americans? I mean, you have just referenced that to the end, but you're talking a lot about the academy, for example, and what the academy limits and what it can do well. But if you could focus that more on pastors in the church and what they're to draw from or take away from.
Right. I mean, I think that's the heart of Professor Garcia-Johnson's question that he projected, which is what does it look like to live within this mess that you've described? And what I offer in the book is that in our analyses, we need to deflate the power of racial concepts in our explanations for things. But the other constructive argument is to say that we, in a sense, need to offer different idioms of political economy other than exploitation and domination. And in order to do that, then we need to erect reparative structures and systems, right, that give traction to a different way of imagining the world. So I mean very practical states of affairs, right? Very practical commitments that it seems to me Christian churches are especially well positioned to at least try. And here I point to the different practices of Redeemer, different repetitive practices with communities, things like in terms of how they imagine income, how they imagine their own satiation of worldly goods, the kinds of relationships they have with neighbors, where they choose to live. In some sense, this is what I mean by there's a failure of nerve on the question of political economy. I think if Christians take the question of political economy seriously, right, the implications will be pretty obvious, but they will be scary for those nourished on these things. So then we need to think about things like mission and evangelism in terms of maybe the old familiar language of how we love our neighbors in practical ways, given the resources, those of us who are in positions of privilege, to dispossess ourselves and make use of for neighbors. And I talk about neighborhood communities, local churches. You can imagine the same articulation in terms of other contexts. So I mean these kinds of things.
Thank you.
But I'd also, do you?
Yeah, that's true. We'd like to. This is for all panelists. if you'd like to respond, because your name was mentioned in that.
Well, yeah, thank you for reflecting on our responses so thoughtfully. I guess I wanted to, well, before I get to that question, I kind of wanted to respond to what Jonathan had to say, if that's okay. So I think I agree that the model of Redeemer, the model that you put forward, the constructive model, is not one of perfection, because then that would just sort of bring us back to the model minority myth, right? That would just kind of bring us back into we would fall into the trap that we are trying to escape.
We would make them the ultimate model minorities.
Right. So, and that the case that you're really trying to make is one of faithfulness, and I get that. But I guess the idea of a case study, it means that you're going to be able to draw ethical implications from it in a way that other Asian American communities are going to try to emulate. And I wonder, not all Asian American church communities are going to be able to start a day spring or a RISE preparatory school. And so I guess I wonder, if you don't have that kind of capital to help kind of foster your imagination, what other resources do you have to help that along? I think that the attention to space, the attention to your local community and how you're embedded in that local community, I think that is a really important point that I take away from this particular case study. But I feel like there are so many other things that kind of distract from that, maybe. Obviously, no book is perfect. You're putting your stake in the sand, and that's an act of courage that I do want to acknowledge. But that's just my question. Yeah.
Well, another question about, you mentioned DEI initiatives in higher education, and this questioner would like to ask more about it. He agrees, or she or he agrees with you, that the framework is problematic, but can you give some advice for university administrators engaged in DEI work?
Just to be clear, when I wrote my remarks, I did not know that Professor Garcia-Johnson heads up DEI at Fuller. But in some ways, I'm glad he does, because
Daniel did it on purpose.
I feel like the post-colonial, decolonial context helps us along, because it reveals the fissures in much of that work. And so I actually, in this kind of going around the country talking about the book, at a university I was invited to give a lecture on the book, I gave a talk that was why DEI fails and how we can do DEI better. And the brief conversation of what you are trying to do here, I think very much follows that out. I think maybe even half the battle is to recognize the discourse is corrupt. But that doesn't mean the end of the discourse. So DEI fails, and there's empirical studies for this, right? I should back up and say, one of the shocking things about DEI culture and its bureaucratization, institutionalization in almost every institution in America, higher ed and certainly the private sector, is how much we rely on it without ever even asking whether there's empirical evidence that it does anything, whether it actually diversifies communities. When there have been studies, they have not been good. In many cases, in the 10 years after the institution of a DEI program, the place has become less diverse. And institutional behavioralists, folks who study this, they can predict why. It's what Mona Sue Weismark, the psychoanalyst at Harvard, calls the preemptive double pejorative. When an institution tells its employees, we have a problem and you're it, you can pretty much guess how people are going to respond to that as a motivation. And so they show all the ways this stuff doesn't tend to work. Right? It doesn't tend to work to tell people that they're racist or sexist. They very may well be, but motivating them out of their racism or sexism doesn't usually work well that way. So there's a whole discourse on this, and it's shocking to me how very seldomly institutions consult that, as if consulting that, right, were in a sense to try to betray the work of anti-racism or greater gender equality. The cynical read is that institutions don't care whether it works or not, simply for one reason, that they institute these policies for one reason. It has nothing to do with liberation or equality. It's legal cover so that they can say as an institution, we weren't out of control. We tried it at least. Now, this just raises the questions why courts presume that it works, right, when there's not evidence that it does. But to me, this is what I call the superficial problem with DEI work. There's a deeper problem, and this was articulated at the very origins of DEI in the 1960s, right? When, for example, the federal government began to require, mandate certain kinds of training. Early radical thinkers, right, began to already smell what was happening here, that these were half measures meant to satisfy a certain critique to make it suggest like we're interested in liberation. What we're very interested, right, was simply holding up the structures of inequality and domination by dressing it up by so much DEI talk. There's an amazing paper by the radical theorist Asa Vanadin, who's a British thinker, who basically shows that what DEI tries to do, what it ends up doing in most cases, with that in some sense, its greatest ambition is, as I said here, to diversify the elite ranks of society, which clearly the academy is situated within, while keeping in place, in many cases, leaving untouched the ways those structures participate and enable the ongoing domination of that society's most vulnerable people, right? Or the world's most vulnerable people. I think the hope that I have from what you're saying is you're fully aware of this and you're trying to do work. But that's what I meant by a lot of the DEI stuff is stuck, right? And then DEI workers, right, who are, in my mind, some of the bravest, most committed human beings I know, that are stuck in this ongoing cycle where they have to serve various constituencies who want DEI to do the work that's not actually going to lead to the kinds of liberation that they're committed to. And then we just kind of go on and on.
Yeah, so I would agree with everything that Jonathan says. I think that DEI work has often just kind of focused on the diversity part.
DEI is diversity, equity, and
Yeah,
inclusion.
so that has really focused on that diversity as a priority and not the equity and the inclusion, which really speaks more to the structural kind of realities or the structural circumstances that allow for people to work together in a workplace. And so I think that, looking at what, for example, disability studies has to offer us in terms of kind of reframing some of or articulating some of the barriers to equity and inclusion would be also helpful.
Yes, I'd love, Oscar, would you like to speak in onto this? I think it's
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3.
I'm sitting on a very interesting row in weakness, so the power of God will manifest. Well, I agree with what you're saying, and I can add other things. I mean, the more DI work on the D that you do, the more resistance you get from people because you get saturated. There's also the other element. It's not just about compliance, but it's market. So some of us get DEI positions, meaning the institution, not me, but in a way to counter the demand of a market that is becoming a little more aware of those, needs. So that's another element too. So if this is indeed if the experiment of DEI has been sort of manipulated from the state to the private sector and is hitting to the public sector and the religious sectors, what can we do, and what's the experiment that institutions like us can do to make it different? And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter the letters so much as the the social imaginary, the strategy, the positionality, and the praxis that you're trying to do, and how do you do it in a place like this? Meaning, if an office of a DI is the one responsible to solve all the issues of not having diversity and usually not even getting to the equity and the inclusion, right? And that office is there to solve that problem, that's a failed business, because either the whole institution and its most powerful places are part of the solution or nothing will happen. That's number one. So number two, I think it has to be clearly a vision, a critical vision in the line of what we're talking about here, in the leadership. And there needs to be not only the conviction, but also the commitment. And not also of the leadership of DEI, but the senior leaders all the way to the board. And in our case, the faculty, the staff, which I see a lot of energy here. And you have to have some structures dedicated to make sure that this is indeed the case. It's a revival structure that, you know, it's happening, and the voice is there. And also it has to be a cluster of people, I would argue, and I would argue it has to be a cluster of people of color in a place that they're all committed into this and they will provoke. So there's a lot of things that need to happen, and rarely you will find a place when that it's all together to make an equation that can create a different experiment. I'll say we'll give it a try here, and we're trying to have all that, but we can talk more about that. It's a process. It's not never done, never finished, and not guaranteed.
Well, the clock is glaring at me, and we are out of time, so I cannot ask some of the great questions that have been sent to us, but I will share them with you later, Jonathan, so you can think about it. But thank you so much for all of you for being here and for this rich conversation from the audience live and online. And I want to point you again to Dr. Tran's book, Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, because there are a lot of things you probably haven't been able to probe because you haven't read the book yet. So please get your hands on the book. It's not cheap, though, I will say that. But I ordered it at the library here at Fuller, so if you're, you can use the library here to read it. But
it does have the word capitalism as
yes, that's very true, very true. But I just want to let you know, again, that we have other events going on this week. So tomorrow there's a online book panel on learning our names, Asian American Christians on Identity, Relationships, and Vocation, taking place at 12 p.m. PST online, so you can be there possibly from wherever you are. And then Friday night, a workshop called Healing Spiritual and Emotional Wounds, Asian Americans in the Church, led by Dr. David Wang, and an impressive array of respondents. So both panels should be wonderful. Please attend. Thank you all for being here for this rich conversation. Please be well, take good care, and let's take good care of one another. Thank you.
Thank you.